This is a closer look with the Monitor. I'm Craig Blumenshine from Prairie Public. Today we'll have two parts to a closer look with the Monitor. Coming up in just a bit, today the North Dakota Department of Health and Human Services, which administers the state SNAP program, they have pushed back a September 1st deadline, now making that deadline November 1st, when grocers must comply with new rules that will change what SNAP can purchase, that will restrict the use of SNAP benefits for candy, energy drinks, and sweetened beverages. The state says it's part of a 2-year experiment intended to encourage healthier choices, but grocers, particularly those in small rural communities, face new technology costs, employee training, and the potential difficult conversations at the checkout counter, and we'll talk to freelance reporter Ceilidh Kern about that in just a moment. But first, North Dakota lawmakers are preparing for a fast-moving special session focused on kratom, data center secrecy, and property taxes, and funding for the state's military gallery. With public hearings beginning before the session officially convenes, there are opportunities and ways for North Dakotans to make their voices heard. So joining us for a preview of the special session is Amy Dalrymple. She's the editor-in-chief of the North Dakota Monitor. Amy, welcome back to A Closer Look with the Monitor.
Thanks, Greg. Happy to be here.
The special session officially begins Wednesday, but activity at the Capitol starts before then. What should the public, Amy, be watching throughout the week?
Yeah, I think a lot of people are aware of the September 2nd special session, but really the action's going to start on Monday. There is a committee that's studying AI and data centers that's going to be having a meeting, and that one is supposed to be designed to get public input on data centers. That's a meeting that a lot of people are going to be interested in. On Tuesday, the legislature set that aside specifically to get public input on the 5 bill drafts that will be considered in the special session.
Before we get into those bills, Amy, remind us, why did the governor call this special session?
Yeah, the governor called a special session to consider regulating or banning kratom and other related synthetic substances. He cited deaths that have been linked to the substances and also an increase in calls to poison control in North Dakota. Governor Armstrong described it as a public health emergency that couldn't wait until the January regular session.
So the governor issued an executive action relative to kratom. How does that fit together with what may be presented in this upcoming special session about kratom?
So his executive order is in effect for 30 days, and his goes a little bit farther than what legislators are considering in the bills that have been introduced. The executive order does ban natural kratom. The 2 bills that lawmakers are considering, one would regulate natural kratom, kind of similar to how cigarettes are regulated. It would add an age restriction of 21, create some labeling requirements that include a warning label, and also would ban any packaging that appeals to children. The other bill is a ban, but it's focused on synthetic derivatives of kratom, such as 7-OH and other derivatives that could become available in the future. That one also has some criminal penalties for use and possession of those synthetic derivatives.
There's been a kratom working group. They've already received public testimony. Can the public still contribute to this testimony as these bills will be considered in the special session?
Absolutely. So on Tuesday afternoon, that is when the Joint Policy Committee is going to be hearing public testimony on these 2 bills. And so that is a great opportunity for the public. Members of the public can also submit written testimony through the legislative website. There is a deadline of 9 a.m. on Tuesday for that written testimony, so you don't want to wait too long to get that submitted. And you also could email your lawmakers in your area to let them know, what you think about the bill drafts.
Amy, beyond kratom, there will be other proposals that will attract public attention. What's on the docket?
One of the other bills would address what's become controversial, some non-disclosure agreements that have been a part of some data center developments. The bill does not just focus on data centers. It goes beyond that to also include other industrial development, and it would place a temporary moratorium on these non-disclosure agreements that would be in place through June of next year. I think that there is a lot of concern about these NDAs, and this week we even saw the Mandan Planning and Zoning Commission. They recommended for their own ordinance that it include a ban on NDAs. And the developer of a project in Mandan also has already come out and said that they're not going to use NDAs. But on the other hand, I think we're probably going to hear some pushback on this bill about potential unintended consequences, since it would be broader. So I think there probably will be quite a bit of discussion about that bill next week.
All right, Amy, what are other big bills that the session might consider?
Yeah, another bill will be related to the military gallery construction. That, as we've talked on this podcast before, that has stalled because of a lack of private fundraising. And so there is a bill that proposes a $35 million loan from the Bank of North Dakota with the intention that that be paid back in the future with donations. There's not a specific public input scheduled for that on Tuesday, but the public could potentially still weigh in on that on Wednesday and also could submit written testimony on that bill.
How will you and your team, Amy, be following this legislative session? I know our news director, Dave Thompson, will be at the Capitol. What are your plans?
Yeah, we will be there every day next week. We're expecting Wednesday in particular to be a pretty long day. There's one other bill that's really more of a technical correction related to property taxes. And it's pretty technical, so it might not get a lot of news coverage. But where I am going to be watching it is to just see if there's any amendments to it that could have a broader impact. And so that's why we're going to be there every day, just to keep the public informed about the developments with these bills.
And how can the public follow your work, Amy?
Our work is available at northdakotamonitor.com. And next week, we will have a link that is featuring all of our special session coverage that will be prominent on our homepage. People can also subscribe to our free daily newsletter to have the latest emailed every morning.
Amy Dalrymple, she's the editor-in-chief of the North Dakota Monitor, and she joins us periodically on A Closer Look with the Monitor. Thanks, Amy.
Thanks, Craig.
A Closer Look with the Monitor continues. I'm Craig Blumenshine from Prairie Public. The North Dakota Department of Health and Human Services, which administers the state SNAP program, had estimated that 1,000 non-citizens would lose food benefits in North Dakota under the new law. And they're not the only ones, of course. Another estimated 5,600 North Dakotans are expecting to lose SNAP due to stricter work requirements for able-bodied adults without dependents that were also included in a 2025 law. And there are also changes coming to what SNAP recipients can purchase. As recently as August 18th, North Dakota's Health and Human Services said that beginning September 1st, North Dakota would restrict the use of SNAP benefits for candy, energy drinks, and sweetened beverages. State officials said that the 2-year experiment is intended to encourage healthier choices, but grocers, particularly those in rural communities, were facing new technology costs, employee training, and potentially difficult conversations at the checkout counter. So just this morning, the date for grocers to be ready for that change has been pushed back to November 1st. North Dakota Monitor freelance reporter Ceilidh Kern examines how retailers were preparing and what many questions remain just days before that change was to take effect. Ceilidh, welcome to A Closer Look with the Monitor.
Thank you for having me.
Ceilidh, what did HHS say just this morning that will impact when these changes might be implemented?
Yeah, I guess they knew we were recording this podcast, and so they decided to drop in a little change this morning. Like you said, originally these changes were supposed to go into effect September 1st, which is just a few days from now. But the Department of Health and Human Services just announced that they'll be pushing it back 2 months to November 1st. So until then, none of these changes will be going into effect.
What would the practical impact have been? And I guess what will it be now starting November 1st? What will SNAP recipients no longer be able to purchase with their benefits?
Yeah, so you mentioned them earlier. There are a few main categories: candy, as well as sweetened drinks, and that includes all artificially sweetened drinks and most sugar sweetened drinks, as well as energy drinks. And of course, there are some exceptions in each of those categories, but those are the big 3 changes.
What will change at the checkout counter? Do we know? Will store systems just figure this all out as to what's eligible and what's not eligible?
Yes, so that is ideally how it would work. these stores are going to have to update their systems in order to recognize products that are no longer eligible for SNAP and differentiate them from those that are. And so that's what we can expect most grocery stores will have in place, or at least will aim to have in place by that November 1st deadline. But then you can also expect that probably some smaller grocery stores that might not have as advanced a point of sale system, or might not have a point of sale system at all, they might have to rely more on employees recognizing which items can or can't be purchased with SNAP.
And you found that those distinctions aren't always going to be intuitive. Marshmallows, surprisingly, might still qualify, while some fruit snacks or trail mixes, for example, may not. So how difficult do you think this will be for retailers to determine which products fall on which side of the line?
Yeah, it can be a little bit confusing. And just to clarify how those lines might be drawn, particularly with the marshmallows and the trail mix, um, we think of marshmallows as candy, but they are primarily marketed as a baking ingredient, which might allow them to kind of circumvent the new rules. But then on the other hand, we might think of something like trail mix as relatively healthy. But if a trail mix has those little chocolate covered pieces in it, then it's considered a candy. So very interesting distinctions there. And the state has spent some money to make diagrams available for retailers to use. It's sort of like a flow chart that they can follow when they're trying to figure out whether a particular product is still SNAP eligible or not. And they also have some staff available to help when retailers are having particular trouble with a product.
How did the state arrive at this policy, and what connection does it have to federal funding through the Rural Health Transformation Program?
Yes. So when the Rural Health Transformation Program first came about and first started being talked about, states were guaranteed $500 million at least, but they could be considered more competitive applicants and therefore potentially get more money from the program if they adopted certain policies that the Trump administration was promoting, including this healthy choice waiver.
You had reported that there would be a grace period for grocers. Do we know if that grace period now has been extended?
It could be, but we just don't know yet. The press release that the department put out was quite limited, just basically saying that this would be getting pushed, the initial deadline would be getting pushed back, and nothing would be going into effect until then. We don't know yet whether that grace period will still exist or whether it would still be 90 days. We're still waiting on more information on that.
In your reporting, you spoke to grocers, Kaylee. How prepared did they seem to be when they thought September 1st was the date they would have to implement this? Did most understand what would be required of them?
Yeah, there was definitely a mix. I spoke with a few grocers for the story, and they were definitely at different levels of readiness. One that I spoke with actually didn't want to talk to me because she hadn't attended one of the state's webinars yet, and so she didn't really feel like she knew enough about what the changes were or how they'd impact her in order to talk about it with me. And then another grocer I spoke with had heard some more about it and had started to think about the steps she would have to take, but even she didn't yet know like how much it would cost her in order to update her system. There were a lot of grocers that might not know about it at all because the state has been sending out emails and trying to raise awareness through organizations like the North Dakota Grocers Association. But a lot of those emails don't get answered or don't get opened, so there wasn't a whole lot of awareness there. And then even among those who did know about it, they weren't, at least at the time that I spoke with them, entirely aware of all that they would have to change or how it would impact their bottom line.
I'm guessing there's a difference in how successful this transition can be between independent rural grocery stores and larger supermarket chains. But there are costs. You talked about that just a moment ago. What were stores potentially looking at in order to comply?
It can vary a lot. Like you said, a larger grocery store chain is going to have an easier time, we can imagine, trying to implement these changes just because they do have more resources in terms of money, more up-to-date point of sale systems that can be more easily updated, as well as more staff with more expertise in how these systems work and how to update them. But then for a smaller, more rural independent grocery store, one grocer that I spoke with, this wasn't actually her store, but it was the store of someone she knew, who was looking at a cost of potentially $3,000 to $16,000 because they had such an outdated point of sale system that they would either have to manually input every single change, which would require many man hours and the costs that go with that, or if they wanted to just replace their point of sale system with something newer, that's when they could be looking at upwards of $16,000, which is hard for a smaller business like that.
And the state, of course, also plans and has spent a lot of money trying to get ready to implement this $3.5 to $4 million, according to your reporting, to enforce the waiver. Where will that money come from? Where does it come from? And is any of it currently committed to helping retailers with those expenses that you just talked about?
Yes, so that money's coming from a few different places. $1 million of it will be coming from a SNAP education grant that the state already had received. And then the rest of it will come from a mix of federal and state funding. And of that, the state should be covering about 75%, according to an official that I spoke with. And as for whether that money will actually go towards helping retailers, yes and no. Like I said, there are staff available to help grocers with these changes, and the state did invest in diagrams to help them make sense of it all. So some state money has gone towards helping retailers, but in terms of actually defraying the costs of updating their systems, I attended a webinar earlier this summer with grocers, and when one asked whether the state would be financially helping grocers update their systems, one official said that it was something they were looking into, something that they were pursuing, but then another official cut in to say, but since this deadline is coming up, you should just proceed like there won't be any state money available.
What would the penalty be for a store that just can't make it? Do we know? Will they may or may not have a grace period. We talked about that. Mm-hmm. But let's just say after that, they just don't have the resources to do this right now.
Yeah. So if a store is believed to not be complying, there's a few steps that are then followed. They will be put under an investigation. And if that investigation does find that they haven't been complying with the SNAP rules, they'll be given a warning letter that outlines their violations and what they need to do to get back in compliance. And so if they make the changes and get back into compliance, everything's good. They can continue participating in the program. But if they don't, they will be kicked off the program and they won't be able to accept SNAP benefits at their store anymore.
Certainly seems to be a fundamental disagreement here. You reported about this. Supporters see this as a public health measure. The department sees it as a public health measure. Critics see it as government judging the choices of low-income families. How did that tension emerge in your reporting?
Yeah, it really came through in a conversation with one particular grocer. She was from West Hope, North Dakota. And she told me that she's really torn about the policy because on the one hand, she obviously wants people to eat healthier and to lead healthier lives. And she told me, sometimes she sees her customers choosing less healthy options, including families with kids. And she has a concern about it. But on the other hand, she acknowledged that she herself buys unhealthy food sometimes, and that a lot of other folks do. And so she wasn't sure she was in a position, or that most grocers were in a position, to tell people what they could or couldn't buy. And she, in particular, talked about, many of these SNAP families are working families. And so she was torn about telling someone who had just worked long hours that they couldn't buy a candy bar for themselves or for their kids just as a little treat at the end of the day.
How will the state figure out if this has worked? And I'm using that worked term in air quotes that you can't see, but how will they measure outcomes? How are they going to judge success?
Yes, so the state will be tracking and analyzing SNAP households' purchasing habits and comparing that to pre-waiver data. They'll be looking to see how these households' spending changes in those impacted food and beverage categories over time, and see whether the families are actually opting for healthier alternatives. And they'll also be looking at more broadly retailers' transaction data and comparing it to SNAP user data to see if those same households are actually just using their own money to purchase things like candy and soda, since they can't use their SNAP benefits anymore. So they'll overall just be looking to see whether this is actually promoting healthier choices or whether families are just finding workarounds.
You pointed out that 5 other states' food restriction waivers were struck down by a federal court. Why wasn't North Dakota impacted? And could this policy, I guess, still face future legal challenge?
It was sort of just a legal fluke. North Dakota wasn't directly named in that lawsuit, so its waiver wasn't affected. But to answer your question, yes, it definitely could face future legal challenges, and particularly since the case against those 5 other states' waivers was successful. You can imagine that if one judge found some merit in the arguments against their waivers, another judge could find some merit in an argument against North Dakota's. But a North Dakota official that I spoke with said that they are tracking all legal challenges to the waivers and trying to stay abreast of any particular problems that are identified in other states' waivers in order to stay on the right side of the law with this one.
As the new deadline, November 1st, approaches, do we know still what the most important questions remain for grocers, and especially smaller grocers, and for SNAP recipients?
Yes, well, the change that was announced today certainly raises some more questions. So there are a couple that I'll be personally watching as these changes roll out. A big one is, particularly now that this has been pushed back, whether funding might come. With that funding that we talked about before to help stores actually pay for these changes to their systems, they had been, like I said before, a state official said that they were pursuing funding, but that it might not come in time for the deadline, so they needed to proceed like it wasn't going to come. But now that that deadline is coming a bit later, it'll be interesting to see if they are able to secure that, and if they are, how it will be dispersed. And for that matter, for the stores that have already made these changes, whether they could be reimbursed in any way or whether they'll just have to eat those costs, particularly now that they're going to have to revert their systems back to allowing SNAP to be used for things like candy and soda, and then updated again come November. A couple other questions that I'm intrigued by as well are how this change is going to be received by SNAP participants. That was actually something that was explicitly mentioned in the press release announcing the pushback, because the state wanted more time to raise awareness amongst SNAP participants about what would be changing, what they would or wouldn't be able to buy with their SNAP benefits anymore. It'll be interesting to see how the state tries to go about doing that and whether it's successful. And one other thing is I'm very intrigued to see how it impacts cross-border travel, because an interesting little loophole in the system is that even though SNAP is a federal program, these waivers are on a state-by-state basis, benefits are on a state-by-state basis. And so you could easily see someone from North Dakota driving into Minnesota or into another state in order to use their SNAP benefits on something that they wouldn't be able to here in North Dakota. So you could see a family from Fargo driving over to Moorhead to buy candy with their SNAP benefits, even though they wouldn't be able to do that back home.
They were eligible for SNAP benefits, but they could just drive to another state and use those SNAP benefits there.
Yeah, and Minnesota doesn't have a waiver, so anything that can currently be bought using SNAP in North Dakota will continue to be purchasable over there. So it'll be really interesting to see how that impacts grocery stores on both sides of the various state lines, and whether we see that increase in traffic.
Ceilidh Kern is a freelance reporter for the North Dakota Monitor. Her story reported that North Dakota grocers prepared for new SNAP restrictions amid uncertainty, and that was assuming a September 1st deadline, which she will now report today has been pushed to November 1st. Ceilidh, thank you for joining us and helping us understand this change and what it means for retailers and families across the state. Thanks for joining us on A Closer Look with the Monitor.
Thank you so much.